So first I'm going to draw the framework that I'm going to use for my study on the whiteboard so that we can talk about it as we answer the questions for question number 3. So Tinto's theory of student departure and Aston's theory of student development both focus on engagement as being an integral aspect of retention. Teranzini and Reason's parsing model offers us a little better understanding of the complexity of the different pieces of this puzzle. And because multiple influential factors are accounted for, the outcomes are broader than just retentions as well. So it incorporates learning outcomes, personal growth outcomes, things of that nature. It's not simply can we keep the students, but now we're thinking about their success on multiple different levels. Now, in looking at high-impact practices, we'll be mostly examining how components in this middle section are related to classroom experiences, out-of-class experiences, and curricular experiences of the students in this section over here. And then with the NESI data, we'll be pulling in some organizational context as well. So let me give you a chart that's going to help demonstrate how these different pieces align. So my plan is to collect data about pre-college characteristics in order to control for underlying differences in academic preparation. And then you can see in the left-hand column of Table 1 are the areas from the parsing model that will be specifically measured and tested. And the first few rows are classroom areas of interest, out-of-class, curricular student experiences, and then at the bottom we have the outcomes of interest. And from reading Cresswell's research design text, I'm aware that my epistemological orientation is post-positivism. This traces back to my training in my master's program in the psychology department as well. So in this, the idea is that although reality may be impacted by our own biases and perspectives of the world, there is still something that can be measured if we do so with careful, rigorous methodology. And that's what I plan to do. So the awareness that we all have of our own bias calls for careful and objective measurement. In column 2, you'll see the justification for selection of data points and data sources, which are in the last 2 columns. I am proposing to use secondary data from the Institutional Research and Planning Department. Thank you, Dr. Malk. And from Linda Seifert's Gen Ed Assessment Department, although I've been told Linda Seifert's not going to be in charge of that by the time I get around to that. So I've met Lee Bullard, who has agreed to help me with that as well. And I'm going to get from the Gen Ed Assessment Department the information that they have on student learning outcomes using those value rubrics. So after having met with Linda Seifert, I became aware that her department has rubric scores for each of the learning goals set by the institution that include inquiry, information literacy, critical thinking, thoughtful expression, second language, and diversity. The one of the 8 that's not represented here is knowledge acquisition, and that's because that's what the faculty are doing. So I'm going to include these as my dependent variables along with GPA and retention, which I'm going to define as returning to the institution in the next consecutive semester from when we look at the initial data. And then the high impact practices that I want to investigate include study abroad, University 201, which is the transfer student seminar, which is sort of equivalent to the freshman year seminar, but specifically designed for transfer students. I want to look at writing intensive courses, undergraduate research, and internships. And each of these will be coded as a yes or no. Either participants participated in them or they did not. And then additionally, I'm going to look at the 5 NESI benchmarks that we talked about in my first article that George Koo wrote, looking at active and collaborative learning, student-faculty interaction, enriching educational activities, level of academic challenge, and supportive campus environment. And my hope is that by looking at actual student learning data from the Gen Ed department, I can triangulate that with the NESE data. So it'll give me a couple of different sources of information from which to triangulate and validate my data. Because I'm using data that the university already has collected, I don't have to recruit participants per se. So after I submit and receive my IRB approval, I'm going to make a formal request for data from the appropriate department heads and then conduct my analysis on this data. I plan to use a multiple regression analysis to examine the relative influence of HIPs on the student success outcomes. And as I said before, I'm going to control for pre-college characteristics that might impact this data, so SAT scores and the like. Now, I will acknowledge that other than understanding basically what a multiple regression analysis is, I don't know how to run one, so I have ordered a textbook off of Amazon that's going to help me with that. So I've got some things to learn about statistics in order to be able to analyze this data that I'm going to get. But that's my basic plan, and I'm basically looking to come up with a regression model that will show me with my transfer students how much of the variation in their student success outcomes can be explained by participating in high impact practices. And the idea behind that is that given the lack of data, the inconsistency of the data on high impact practices, I want to provide some information to both UNCW but also to the community, to the higher education community, about whether high impact practices work for transfer students, or if there's certain high impact practices that work for transfer students and others that don't. And then couch that back in with the literature to maybe come up with some explanation as to why that's the case. But the idea is, with budgets as tight as they are, we have to figure out a strategy for spending our money wisely. And so if we're spending a whole lot of money to support students in doing study abroad, or paying faculty to read multiple drafts of papers in writing intensive courses, and that's not really working, then we maybe ought to think about redirecting our resources elsewhere. And so that's the goal of my study, is to sort of give us some information about what works and what doesn't work with transfer students, since that's a growing population that we have to contend with.